A son gives up his career to care for his wheelchair-bound mother, but when he installs cameras in his home, he discovers that she is walking in the middle of the night, keeping a secret that will change their lives forever. Julio looked out the window of his small apartment, a light layer of dew covering the leaves of the trees in the courtyard. He had left behind the imposing buildings, the long project meetings, and the endless engineering calculations, all to be there in that quiet house taking care of Dona Marina, his mother, a daily routine that, although predictable, had become the center of his existence. Every morning began the same way, making breakfast, checking that the medicine was in place, and helping Marina get dressed and transfer to her wheelchair. Marina, though grateful, rarely spoke much. Since the accident, her mood had changed, becoming quieter and more contemplative. Julio tried not to think too much about how his life had transformed. There were days when a feeling of satisfaction filled him, caring for the one who had given him everything. But other days, a knot of resignation settled in his chest. While he was washing the breakfast dishes, he heard a soft noise coming from Marina's room. It was a barely audible sound, as if something small had fallen on the floor. As he approached, he found nothing out of the ordinary. Marina was in her chair, leafing through an old magazine. "Everything okay, Mom?" he asked, trying to keep his voice quiet. "Everything's fine, son," she replied without taking her eyes off the paper. Julio let the incident pass, attributing it to fatigue or his imagination. But as night fell, while he was checking his mail in the dining room, another noise broke his concentration. This time the sound was clearer, a slight but unexpected knock, as if someone was moving something in the kitchen. Entering, he found nothing out of place, only the echo of his own footsteps on the cold tiles. "It's an old house," he told himself. "Things creak." Yet something remained in the back of his mind, like an alarm that had barely been turned on. Over the next few days, small changes began to accumulate. A cup he had left on the table appeared in a different place. The blanket on the sofa was folded in a different way. Julio tried to rationalize it, thinking it was the result of his own absent-mindedness, or perhaps Marina moving objects with the help of her cane. But the doubt grew ever deeper. There were nights when he stayed awake longer than usual, listening for the slightest sound. The house, once a safe haven, now seemed like a space full of secrets. The shadows in the corners seemed thicker, and every creak in the floor felt like a whisper. Translated from Spanish to English. www.onlinedoctranslator.com. One morning, as he helped Marina get into bed after a particularly long day, he couldn't help but be overcome by a strange thought. What if something was happening without him knowing? Over time, these events ceased to be mere curiosities. Julio began to perceive them as something more, something out of the ordinary. But he still wasn't sure what to do about it. He just watched and waited, unaware that the first pieces of a mystery were slowly falling into place in his life. The next morning, while washing the breakfast utensils, Julio couldn't stop thinking about the strange events of the last few days. Every little noise, every out-of-place object, fueled a restlessness that was beginning to grow inside him. He tried to distract himself by organizing the pantry, but his mind kept returning to the idea that something in the house wasn't right. Dona Marina watched him from the table, sipping her tea in silence. There was something in her attitude that seemed different, although Julio couldn't quite put his finger on it. She had always been reserved, but at these moments she seemed even more restrained, as if she were also keeping a secret. That afternoon, while picking up some groceries at the market, he made a decision that calmed him, at least temporarily. He walked to a nearby electronics store and bought a basic security camera system. "It's just a precaution," he told himself, although he knew his motives went beyond protecting his mother. The feeling of losing control of his own environment was something he couldn't ignore. Back home, he began to discreetly install the cameras. He placed one in the hallway that connected his room to Marina's, another in the living room, and one in the kitchen. He tried not to think too much about what he expected to find, telling himself that it was probably all a product of his imagination and accumulated fatigue. However, each screw he tightened seemed to reinforce his fear that something bigger was happening. As he adjusted the last camera, Marina watched him from her wheelchair, frowning slightly. "What are you doing, Julio?" she asked in a calm but clearly curious voice. "Setting up cameras, May. I just want to make sure we're safe. You know, in case something happens." Marina stared at him for a few seconds, as if trying to decipher his true intentions. Then she simply nodded and returned to her embroidery. That night, Julio set up the system and tested the recordings from his phone. Everything worked perfectly. Before going to sleep, he reviewed the first few hours of footage, looking for anything unusual. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, which gave him a brief moment of relief. However, that relief was short-lived. At 2 in the morning, a noise woke him up. This time it wasn't subtle. It sounded like the clear sound of footsteps, as if someone was walking down the hall. Julio jumped up, checked his phone, and opened the live feed from the cameras. He saw nothing. With her heart racing, she decided to wait until the next morning to review the recordings. She felt a mixture of fear and anxiety, but also a curiosity that she could not suppress. As she returned to bed, a thought crossed her mind. What she was about to discover could change everything. As soon as dawn broke, Julio went straight to his desk. With his phone in his hand, he began to review the camera recordings. For the first few minutes, everything seemed normal. The hallway was silent, the living room empty, the kitchen in darkness. However, when the recording reached 2 in the morning, something caught his attention. In the hallway chamber, a figure moved slowly. Julio squinted in disbelief. It was Marina. His mother, who had not walked for years, was taking determined steps toward the kitchen. His breathing stopped for a moment. He rewound the video, thinking that perhaps he had seen something wrong. But there she was again. Marina, walking without any difficulty, with her back straight and a calm gait. The video continued showing Marina entering the kitchen, opening a drawer, taking out something small, and returning to her room with the same calm. Julio paused the recording, his hands shaking. Everything he had known up until that moment seemed to be collapsing. How was this possible? Was he dreaming? For a few minutes he sat there, staring at his phone, not knowing what to do. His mind was trying to rationalize what he had seen. Maybe it was a dream he was having, and not a real memory. Maybe someone had tampered with the cameras, though that didn't make sense. Marina had never shown any signs of physical recovery, not even trying to move her legs. Finally, he decided to act cautiously. He put the phone in his pocket and went to Marina's room. She was awake, sitting in the wheelchair, looking out the window as if nothing had happened. "Did you sleep well, Mun?" he asked, trying hard to keep his voice calm. "Yes, as always," she answered without taking her eyes off the landscape. Julio watched her closely, looking for any signs that might give her away. But Marina didn't seem any different than usual. There was something almost disturbing about her serenity, as if she were perfectly aware of her actions, but showed no cracks in her facade. He decided not to confront her just yet. He needed more evidence before he could draw any conclusions. For the rest of the day, he acted normally, helping her with her activities and keeping an eye out for any strange behavior. That night, as he went to bed, he made sure the cameras were recording properly. Now his concern was no longer a simple suspicion. It was a certainty that tormented him. Something was not right with Marina, and he was determined to find out what it was, even though he deeply feared what he might find. Julio spent the next few days carefully observing Marina. He tried not to be too obvious, but he couldn't help but look at her with different eyes. Every gesture, every movement of her hands, every word she spoke seemed like a hidden clue. The recording of that night was always in his mind, like a shadow that followed him wherever he went. Meanwhile, memories of his childhood began to surface with unexpected intensity. He remembered how Marina had raised him alone after his father's death. He was barely 8 years old when it happened. Although Marina had always been a strong woman, the tragedy had transformed her. She had thrown herself completely into caring for Julio, making sure he wanted for nothing. But now those memories seemed to be tinged with nuances he hadn't noticed before. Moments he once considered simple displays of love and protection now seemed like acts laden with silent control. For example, the way Marina had always insisted that he didn't need friends because she was there for him, or how, during his teenage years, any plan outside the house was met with a disapproving look that made him feel guilty. Julio tried to put the pieces together, searching for a pattern that would explain what was happening now. During the day, Marina seemed completely dependent on him. She asked for help to move, to reach things on shelves, even for simple tasks like adjusting a blanket. But at night while he slept, the recordings showed a completely different reality. Marina walked with a confidence that defied all logic. One afternoon, while she was taking a nap, Julio decided to explore the trunk he kept in the hall closet. It was an old trunk, one that had always been there, but was rarely open. Inside, he found a number of seemingly harmless objects: old photographs, letters, small mementos. However, upon looking closer, he discovered something that caught his eye. It was a photograph of his father and Marina, taken shortly before the accident that had supposedly left her in a wheelchair. They were both smiling, but there was something strange about the way Marina looked at him. It wasn't the expression of a woman in love. It was something colder, more distant. Julio stared at the photo for a long moment, as if searching for answers in his mother's eyes. As he packed his things back up, another memory came to mind. It was a rainy day, shortly after the accident. Marina was crying in the living room, but when he entered, her expression immediately changed. "Everything will be okay," he told her, in a calm, almost rehearsed voice. Now that phrase resonated differently. That night, as he watched yet another recording, Julio felt that he was getting closer to uncovering a truth that had been buried for years. But he also feared what that truth could mean for him and for the relationship he had built with his mother. Julio's uneasiness had grown so much that he could no longer ignore it. That night, while Marina slept, he decided to return to the trunk in the closet. He knew there was more than harmless memories there. He was sure he would find something that would help him understand what was happening. She searched every corner of the trunk carefully, trying not to leave anything out of place. Among the photographs and old objects, she found a small brown envelope, folded and yellowed by time. Opening it, she extracted a handwritten letter. In a handwriting she immediately recognized as her mother's. The content of the letter left him breathless. "Julio, if you ever read this, I want you to understand that I did it out of fear. When I found out your father betrayed me, I felt like my world was falling apart. But the worst part wasn't losing him, it was losing you. You were all I had, and I was afraid that if you thought I was strong, you would walk away. I knew you had big dreams, but I couldn't bear the thought of the world taking you away from me. So I made a choice. I pretended. I pretended to be weaker than I really was, thinking that way you would always want to stay by my side. I know it was wrong, but I did it because I couldn't lose you. Forgive me, son." Julio dropped the letter on the trunk and sat on the floor, unable to process what he had just read. Everything he believed about his life, about Marina, about the sacrifices he had made, was based on a lie. He felt a wave of contradictory emotions: sadness, anger, betrayal, but also a pang of compassion. He thought of the years he had spent caring for his mother, the opportunities he had missed, the relationships he had put aside, all because of a sense of duty that now felt manipulated. But at the same time, he could imagine Marina's fear, the emptiness she must have felt after her husband's death, and the desperation that had led her to make such a radical decision. The next morning, Julio couldn't help but act differently. He looked at Marina with different eyes, searching for signs of guilt or remorse. However, she seemed the same as always: calm, dependent, seemingly oblivious to the weight of the truth he now knew. He spent the day in a state of disconnection, almost automatic. He helped Marina with her routine, but avoided looking at her directly or engaging in deep conversation. Every time he tried to talk to her, the image of the letter appeared in his mind as a reminder of everything she had hidden. That night, while he was alone in the living room, he picked up the letter again and read it several times. Although its content was devastating, it was also a window into Marina's fears and motivations. For the first time, Julio understood that the manipulation had not been a matter of malice, but of a love deformed by fear and insecurity. But knowing this didn't make it hurt any less. He felt like the ground beneath his feet had cracked, and he didn't know how to move forward without confronting her. He decided to wait a little while. Gather strength and think carefully about how to approach the subject. He wanted to understand everything before taking the next step, although he knew that confrontation was inevitable. The days that followed were fraught with tension. Julio tried to maintain his usual routine, but every interaction with Marina was tinged by the weight of what he knew. There was something in her gaze, in her way of moving, that now seemed different to him, as if the image he had built of her throughout his life was crumbling before his eyes. He decided he couldn't broach the subject directly just yet. First, he needed to observe her more closely, look for inconsistencies, signs that confirmed what the letter had already revealed. So he began asking indirect questions, comments that seemed innocent, but were meant to test her boundaries. One afternoon, while Marina was embroidering in the living room, Julio sat in front of her with a cup of coffee in his hands. "Mom, do you remember when we were younger and we used to take those walks in the park?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Marina looked up for a moment, her face as serene as ever. "Sure, son. That was before the accident, when I could still walk. Those were good times." Her answer was precise, almost rehearsed, as if she had told the story too many times. Julio noticed that her hands trembled slightly as she returned to her embroidery, but she said nothing more. Later, while helping Marina to bed, he decided to try something different. As he arranged her on the bed, he deliberately dropped one of her pills on the floor. "Oh, wait, I dropped one. Let me pick it up," he said, bending down slowly while glancing at Marina. She remained motionless, as always, but something in her expression changed. It was only for an instant, a shadow of tension that crossed her face before it returned to its usual peaceful demeanor. Julio picked up the pill and placed it on the bedside table, without saying anything else. At night, as he reviewed the camera footage, he searched for more clues. The images remained disconcerting. Marina walking, sometimes for long periods, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But the next day, she was again the same dependent, fragile woman he had always known. Julio was beginning to feel trapped in a web of contradictions. He wanted to confront her, but at the same time, he was afraid of breaking the fragile balance of their relationship. He had spent so much time taking care of her that he didn't know what his life would be like if everything suddenly changed. Marina, for her part, seemed to notice that something was different. Her glances at Julio were longer, more inquisitive. Although she didn't say anything, her attitude suggested that she knew he was on the verge of revealing everything. The house, once a safe haven, now felt like a stage where they were both playing a role. Julio knew he couldn't go on like this for long. Sooner or later, someone would have to say the first word. The tension in the house had reached an unbearable point. Julio knew he could no longer avoid confrontation. That night after dinner, he decided the time had come. He sat down in front of Marina in the living room, with the letter in his hands. The paper was slightly wrinkled from the number of times he had read it, but it still retained the intensity of his words. Marina looked at him curiously at first, but that curiosity soon turned into a mix of alertness and apprehension when she noticed her son's serious expression. "Mom," Julio began, his voice firmer than she expected, "I need to talk to you. It's important." She put aside her embroidery and folded her hands in her lap. "Sure, son. Tell me, what's wrong?" Without saying a word, Julio handed her the letter. Marina looked at it for a moment before taking it. Her expression didn't change as she read, but her hands shook slightly. When she finished, she put the letter down on the table, took a breath, and looked up at her son. "I guess you know everything by now," he said, his voice calm but loaded with emotional weight. "I want to hear it from you, mine. I want to understand why you did this," Julio replied, trying to control the tremble in his voice. Marina nodded, as if she had been waiting for this moment for a long time. "I did it out of fear, Julio. When I lost your father, I not only felt like I had lost my husband, but I was afraid of losing you too. You are all I have, and in my desperation, I thought that if I needed you, you would never leave me." Julio listened to her attentively, but he couldn't help but feel a mixture of anger and sadness. "And you thought that faking a disability would be the solution? Do you know what I have sacrificed for you, thinking that you had no one else in the world?" Her voice rose slightly, although she tried to remain calm. "I know," Marina replied, tears in her eyes. "Every day that passed, I saw how far you were moving away from your dreams and how much you devoted yourself to me. I wanted to stop you, but it was too late. I didn't know how to get out of the lie without losing you completely." Silence filled the room for a moment. Julio looked at his mother, trying to process her words. He had been waiting for this confrontation for days, but now that it was happening, he felt empty, as if all the emotions had spilled out and left a void inside him. "This isn't just a lie, May. This is my whole life, my career, my friends, my relationships, everything revolved around taking care of you. How did you expect me to react when I found out? Marina looked down, unable to respond. Tears were streaming down her face, and for the first time in years, she looked truly vulnerable. I'm so sorry, Julio. I never wanted to hurt you. I thought I did it out of love, but now I understand that it was selfishness. Julio took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. There were so many conflicting emotions inside him: the pain of betrayal, the understanding of his mother's motivations, and a love that, though wounded, was still there. I need time, May, to think, to understand how to move forward. This won't be fixed with an immediate forgiveness. Marina nodded slowly, accepting his words with resignation. Take all the time you need, son, but I want you to know that I will do everything I can to repair what I have broken if you give me the chance. The conversation ended in a heavy silence, but there was also something liberating in the air. The truth, although painful, had come to light, and they both knew it was the first step towards something new. The days following the confrontation were strange for Julio. For the first time in a long time, he didn't know how to act in his own home. The routines he had previously performed almost automatically now felt heavy, as if every movement was loaded with emotions he didn't know how to process. Marina, for her part, seemed quieter than usual. Though she had never been particularly talkative, her silences were different now, filled with a mix of embarrassment and expectation. Julio could feel her gaze on him in quiet moments, as if she were waiting for a sign of reconciliation, but he wasn't ready to offer it. One afternoon, he decided to leave the house to clear his mind. He called Carla, a friend from college with whom he had recently reconnected. Talking to her had always given him a sense of clarity, and this time was no exception. They met at a small cafe, where Carla greeted him with a warm smile that seemed to lighten the weight he was carrying. You look exhausted, Julio. Everything okay? Carla asked after a while of light chat. Julio sighed and took a sip of his coffee before answering. It's complicated. My mother, well, I found out things about her that I don't know how to handle. It's like everything I believed about my life had been a lie. Carla listened attentively, letting him speak without interruption. Julio told her about the letter, about the recordings, and about the confrontation. When he finished, he felt that a weight had been lifted a little, although the problem was still there. And what are you going to do now? Carla asked, looking at him with genuine concern. I don't know, Julio admitted. I've dedicated my whole life to taking care of her, and now I feel like I've wasted years because of a decision she made out of fear. But I also know that I love her, and I can't just leave her. Carla nodded slowly, giving him time to process his own words before answering. Julio, you can't change what happened, but you can decide how to move forward. Your mother made a terrible decision, but she seems sorry. The question is, what do you want for yourself? Do you want to continue living this life, or do you need to start thinking about yourself? Her words left him thoughtful. As much as he wanted to stay, he felt a growing need to get his life back, to be the man he once dreamed of being. When he came home that night, he found Marina sitting in her wheelchair, looking at an old photograph of the two of them. The expression on her face was one of sadness, but also of something else, a kind of acceptance. Julio knew she sensed his distance, but she didn't say anything. As he went to bed, his thoughts were still torn between his duty to his mother and his love for her, and his desire to find a life that was truly his own. The decision was there, waiting to be made, but he knew it would not be easy, neither for him nor for Marina. The next morning, Julio woke up feeling like he had made a decision, although he wasn't entirely sure how to put it. He knew he couldn't continue living the same way, caught between resentment and sacrifice. It was time to talk to Marina, even if the conversation would be difficult. He found her in the living room, busy with her embroidery. For a moment, he stared at her in silence. Despite everything that had happened, she was still his mother, and a part of him still loved her deeply. He took a deep breath and sat down opposite her. Mom, we need to talk, he said, breaking the silence. Marina looked up, putting the embroidery aside. Her expression was calm, but her eyes reflected a mixture of fear and resignation. Tell me, son, I'm ready for whatever you have to say. Julio ran a hand through his hair, trying to organize his thoughts. I can't go on like this, he began, his voice firmer than I expected. I can't go on carrying on with this life we built on a lie. What you did, although I understand it, hurt me deeply. You took years from me, opportunities, and you took myself from me. Marina nodded slowly, as if she had already anticipated those words. I know, Julio. I have no excuses. I did what I did thinking it was the best thing, but I know I hurt you, and I'm willing to accept the consequences. That's what I want to discuss, Julio continued. I need to get my life back. I want to go back to work, to have a career, to be who I always wanted to be. But I don't want to abandon you either. Marina looked at him, confused at first, but then nodded, waiting for him to continue. I've been thinking of a solution. I can make sure you have the care you need, professionals to help you during the day. And I can still visit you, but I can't be here all the time. I need that space to find myself again. Marina looked down, her hands shaking slightly. For a long moment, she said nothing. Julio waited, dreading her reaction. Finally, she looked up, her eyes filled with tears. I don't want to lose you, Julio, but I understand that I've already taken too much from you. If this is what you need, I'll accept it. It won't be easy, but I'll do my part to help you find your way. Julio felt a weight lighten on his chest. Although he knew the road would not be easy, at least he had managed to come up with a solution that could work for both of them. Thank you, May. This doesn't mean I love you any less. I just need to be myself again. Marina nodded, wiping her tears with a handkerchief. I understand, son, and I will do my best to support you, as I should have done from the beginning. The deal was done, though they both knew it would be difficult to carry out. But for the first time in a long time, there seemed to be a chance for balance, a chance to rebuild their relationship from a place of honesty. You look exhausted, Julio. Everything okay? Carla asked after a while of light chat. Julio sighed and took a sip of his coffee before answering. It's complicated. My mother, well, I found out things about her that I don't know how to handle. It's like everything I believed about my life had been a lie. Carla listened attentively, letting him speak without interruption. Julio told her about the letter, about the recordings, and about the confrontation. When he finished, he felt that a weight had been lifted a little, although the problem was still there. And what are you going to do now? Carla asked, looking at him with genuine concern. I don't know, Julio admitted. I've dedicated my whole life to taking care of her, and now I feel like I've wasted years because of a decision she made out of fear. But I also know that I love her, and I can't just leave her. Carla nodded slowly, giving him time to process his own words before answering. Julio, you can't change what happened, but you can decide how to move forward. Your mother made a terrible decision, but she seems sorry. The question is, what do you want for yourself? Do you want to continue living this life, or do you need to start thinking about yourself? Her words left him thoughtful. As much as he wanted to stay, he felt a growing need to get his life back, to be the man he once dreamed of being. When he came home that night, he found Marina sitting in her wheelchair, looking at an old photograph of the two of them. The expression on her face was one of sadness, but also of something else, a kind of acceptance. Julio knew she sensed his distance, but she didn't say anything. As he went to bed, his thoughts were still torn between his duty to his mother and his love for her, and his desire to find a life that was truly his own. The decision was there, waiting to be made, but he knew it would not be easy, neither for him nor for Marina. The next morning, Julio woke up feeling like he had made a decision, although he wasn't entirely sure how to put it. He knew he couldn't continue living the same way, caught between resentment and sacrifice. It was time to talk to Marina, even if the conversation would be difficult. He found her in the living room, busy with her embroidery. For a moment, he stared at her in silence. Despite everything that had happened, she was still his mother, and a part of him still loved her deeply. He took a deep breath and sat down opposite her. Mom, we need to talk, he said, breaking the silence. Marina looked up, putting the embroidery aside. Her expression was calm, but her eyes reflected a mixture of fear and resignation. Tell me, son, I'm ready for whatever you have to say. Julio ran a hand through his hair, trying to organize his thoughts. I can't go on like this, he began, his voice firmer than I expected. I can't go on carrying on with this life we built on a lie. What you did, although I understand it, hurt me deeply. You took years from me, opportunities, and you took myself from me." Marina nodded slowly, as if she had already anticipated those words. "I know, Julio. I have no excuses. I did what I did thinking it was the best thing, but I know I hurt you, and I'm willing to accept the consequences." "That's what I want to discuss," Julio continued. "I need to get my life back. I want to go back to work, to have a career, to be who I always wanted to be. But I don't want to abandon you either." Marina looked at him, confused at first, but then nodded, waiting for him to continue. "I've been thinking of a solution. I can make sure you have the care you need, professionals to help you during the day. And I can still visit you, but I can't be here all the time. I need that space to find myself again." Marina looked down, her hands shaking slightly. For a long moment, she said nothing. Julio waited, dreading her reaction. Finally, she looked up, her eyes filled with tears. "I don't want to lose you, Julio, but I understand that I've already taken too much from you. If this is what you need, I'll accept it. It won't be easy, but I'll do my part to help you find your way." Julio felt a weight lighten on his chest. Although he knew the road would not be easy, at least he had managed to come up with a solution that could work for both of them. "Thank you, May. This doesn't mean I love you any less. I just need to be myself again." Marina nodded, wiping her tears with a handkerchief. "I understand, son, and I will do my best to support you, as I should have done from the beginning." The deal was done, though they both knew it would be difficult to carry out. But for the first time in a long time, there seemed to be a chance for balance, a chance to rebuild their relationship from a place of honesty. The days that followed the agreement were a whirlwind of change. Julio began looking for an agency that could provide professional care for Marina. It was a more difficult process than he expected, not only because of the logistical details, but also because of the emotional burden involved in delegating that responsibility that he had carried with him for years. Eventually, she found a caregiver named Rosanna, a kind and experienced woman who, from the first moment, demonstrated empathy and professionalism. Marina, although reluctant at first, slowly began to adapt to the new presence in the house. Julio watched closely how they interacted, looking for any signs of discomfort or dissatisfaction, but soon realized that he had made the right decision. Meanwhile, Julio began to get back on track with his engineering career. He reorganized his resume, sent out applications, and within weeks was hired by an engineering firm that valued his experience and dedication. Although the work was demanding, he felt revitalized, as if a part of him that had been dormant had finally awakened. Marina, for her part, also began to transform. With Rosanna's help, she began to do small activities that had previously depended exclusively on Julio. She even accepted the idea of receiving physiotherapy, something she had avoided for years. As she gained more independence, her attitude changed as well. There were times when Julio would see her smile while watering the plants or reading a book, and he would feel a mixture of relief and pride. One afternoon when Julio returned from work, he found Marina waiting for him in the living room. She was holding an old photo of the two of them, taken when he was a child. "I want to thank you, son," he said with a faint smile, "for not abandoning me even when I gave you reason to do so." Julio sat next to her, taking the photo in his hands. "Mom, it wasn't easy, but I think we're in a better place now, for both of us." She nodded, her eyes shining. "And I want you to know that I'm proud of you. I always was, even if I didn't know how to show it the right way." The conversation was brief but meaningful. For the first time in years, they both felt they could communicate without barriers, without the weight of lies or resentment. Over time, Julio became involved in a personal project that he had devised after his experience as a caregiver. He designed an online platform to help other people in similar situations find resources and emotional support. The idea arose from his own struggle and the need to create a network for those who, like him, had to balance love for their loved ones with the need to find their own way. The project quickly took shape, and Marina, in her newfound independence, became its biggest advocate. She even sat in on interviews to share her story, hoping that others could learn from her mistakes. A year later, the relationship between mother and son was different. Although it had not been easy, both had found a balance based on honesty and mutual respect. Julio, who visited Marina regularly, But now those visits were moments of enjoyment, not obligation. One afternoon, while they were having tea together in the garden, Marina looked at Julio with a genuine smile. "You know, I was always afraid that the world would take you away from me, but now I understand that you never stopped being here, even when your life took a different direction." Julio looked at her, feeling a warmth in his chest that he hadn't experienced for a long time. "And now, May, I know that I will always be here, but this time, from a place where we can both be ourselves." The garden was silent for a moment, save for the bird song in the distance. Although the road had been difficult, they both knew they were at the beginning of something new, a more honest, stronger relationship, full of possibilities for the future. Life sometimes confronts us with difficult choices between love and truth. Julio and Marina's story shows us that even the deepest relationships can be marked by secrets, but also that forgiveness and honesty have the power to rebuild what seemed lost. What would you have done if you discovered that your whole life was based on a lie? Would you be able to forgive? Click on the video on screen to continue this exciting journey of self-discovery and reflect on how our choices affect those we love. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that touch our hearts and make us question our own lives. See you in the next video.